Tony Williamson told me that over the years, there's been more vintage Lloyd Loar Gibson F5s to come across his doorway than he can actually count. And he's made it his life work to understanding the historicity and significance of these incredible instruments. In my recent visit to his lovely home in North Carolina, we got into the weeds about all things Lloyd Loar, and I learned so much through this conversation that I just had to share the whole thing with you all here. And I do hope that you enjoy it and that you'll take advantage of Tony's other amazing resources through his Mandolin Central website and his blog at the links down below.
Tony, the kingpin of Lloyd Loar mandolins.
Hi, David. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, man. It's so good to chat. I've been hearing from so many folks. You're the guy to talk to about these mandolins, and I was wondering if you could share a little bit how you got into Lloyd Loars in general.
It came from Bill Monroe, for sure, but just mandolin in general, that happened much earlier when I was about, well, not quite 4 years old. My dad bought my older brother a really cheap mandolin, and I told my older brother that I wanted to try it, and he said, "Don't you dare touch it." So I learned to play it in no time. I mean, a simple Soldier's Joy was my first thing. You know, and yeah, I thought I'd learned everything there was to know about mandolin. My brother, he was kind enough to move on to guitar and then banjo. My cousin came and got me. I guess I was probably about 10 years old, and took me to see Bill Monroe.
Set the bar high right there, you know.
The presence of that man, from his point on stage in front of that microphone, he controlled the whole room. Everybody in the room. All his musicians, everybody's sitting there, riveted. His voice, his manner, his regal bearing, and more than anything, his mandolin. He would hold his mandolin up and go into one of those. And you know, it was like it just blew my mind. Could not believe it.
Right,
so I immediately started getting as many Bill Monroe records as I could and studying his music. And I guess it was around 60, 67, 68 when I finally got up enough courage to go meet him. And he was very gracious. He invited me back while we were listening to the band play while he's tuning up, and he was just really a gentleman. I found out later he loved kids and he wanted to nurture kids. That was sort of part of his thing. That's, you know. Cool. And in 1969, they had a festival here in North Carolina called Camp Springs. Mm-hmm. And that's when Bill Monroe first handed me his mandolin. Whoa. And I got to look at it.
The mandolin?
The mandolin.
The one that's in the Country Music Hall of Fame right now?
Yeah. And I held it and I looked at it. And he let me play it for a little bit. It was really hard to press those strings down. He had this action so high. And I looked in the peg head, and it looked like this. Now, you see, this one says the Gibson in a script, right? On Bill Monroe's mandolin, it just said the. He had carved out the Gibson. He had sent his mandolin back for frets or a new fingerboard, I think is what the order was, and they didn't replace the fingerboard. What they did was refinish his mandolin, and when you put a big thick finish on the top of an instrument, it kills the tone. And he was so angry he scraped the finish off and dug out the Gibson. Well, I'm standing there, I'm 15 years old, I'm looking up here trying to figure out what kind of mandolin this is, and I see and then I look inside and I see this signature, this flowing script, kind of a left-handed signature, Lloyd Loar. And I was like, oh man, that's what I want. I want one of those. Well, there was actually a man at that very festival that had a Lloyd Loar mandolin for sale. Oh, wow. Yeah, and he wanted $1,000. What? So, this is 1969. $1,000, wow. Yeah, you could buy a used car for less than that. Unreal. So I went running down to see my dad and said, there's a man up on the hill that's got a Lloyd Loar mandolin for sale, and it's only $1,000. Can we get it? And my dad looked at me and he said, son, I believe if I was going to pay that much money for a mandolin, I'd go ahead and get a Gibson.
You wouldn't get a the.
Yeah, you don't want a the, you want a Gibson.
So close.
So I did not say anything because I grew up in a generation where you just you don't correct your parents, But I began studying them and searching them, meeting people who had these mandolins. It was always an exciting thing when that old case like I showed you earlier, when it showed up at a festival, you immediately dropped what you were doing and go start following that guy. And it was not till I was in the Bluegrass Alliance that I got my first Loar, and we'll be seeing it here in a minute. But this is the second one I ever got. The reason I wanted to start with this one, it's a 1923, and it's also in pristine condition.
Oh, it's lovely.
Never needed repair. It's got a lot of play wear because it's been played a lot. The guy before me played it quite a lot, and I've played it quite a lot. But it is a terrific sounding instrument. Bill Monroe was a huge influence on me all through those years, and he was always so gracious to me too.
I never got to meet him, never got to hear him play in person, sadly, but I know he's really shaped the whole American landscape of mandolin music in particular. Maybe we could talk about that too, because I know the F5, like you mentioned, was more intended for the concert hall, like classical music when it was first engineered, but now it's so much associated with bluegrass music. Mm-hmm. And what do you think Bill's role was in popularizing the F5 and Lloyd Loar mandolins in general?
I think I'd like to refine the point that the F5 was made for classical music. I've studied the concert programs, mandolin groups from the 20s, and they were playing mostly popular music.
Okay, right.
Now, by popular music, I'm talking about maybe an aria from Rigoletto, or I guess maybe what you might call light classical. Mm-hmm. The only example of, in 1923, the Nordica Mandolin Club of Washington, D.C. performed Beethoven's Fifth on mandolins and banjos.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
I don't know, I'm kind of scared to even think about what that must have sounded like.
A lot of tuning, I imagine, yeah.
But Lloyd Loar and his music, and he mixed it up with all kinds of things. There would be, like I say, arias from operas, but there would be things like My Old Kentucky Home. There were music from the minstrel tradition. There were originals. I think by classical music, these instruments were designed for people who read music, which is different from what they became associated with Bill Monroe. Mm-hmm. The mandolin had pretty well been relegated to a very quiet existence by the 1930s and 40s. You know, the 20s, it had already started to dwindle in popularity. At the turn of the century, from about 1880 to say about 1915, 1917, it was all the rage. Every major city, most universities had mandolin clubs. Wow. Hey, Carolina and Duke both had mandolin clubs, and they would meet. One club would play a song, and the next one would. It was sort of like a basketball tournament, you know?
That's amazing.
Only they were playing mandolins. But 1917, World War I, the pandemic, the influenza epidemic, then there was a deflationary recession. So a lot happened during that time to quell the interest in traditional mandolin music.
Right.
Parlor music, small concert hall kind of music. The biggie was what was coming out of New Orleans. Groups like Buddy Bolton and King Oliver, and then later Louis Armstrong, turned the whole country on fire during the 20s. And the mandolin was really just not keeping up with that in terms of volume alone. And that's one of the reasons Lloyd Loar was hired by Gibson to create a better mandolin. They felt like if they could get the volume up there, they could attract, say, violin players who already knew the fingering into playing in these Dixieland ensembles, and therefore it would open up avenues of employment during tough times. It worked to a certain degree in the beginning, but then the banjo came along and blew it out of the water in terms of sheer volume.
Right.
In fact, I think what you'll see a lot in the history of fretted instruments is a continued search for more volume. If you don't believe me, just go to a rock and roll concert. Go hear Metallica, right?
They won.
So Lloyd Loar made a louder mandolin, but in doing so, he also made a better sounding mandolin.
Yeah.
And we'll talk about the scientific aspect of that here in a minute.
I know one of the big points of discussion surrounding the Lloyd Loar mandolins are those tonal differences between the 1923 batch and the 1924 batch. Could you explain what those differences are to a layman like myself?
Sure. There is a remarkable difference that I hope we'll be able to hear on this recording. The early F5s were designed for projection, for focus, to be able to do the thing in a concert hall that a really great classical violin would, right? The idea is that it's got to be bright. Bright, focused, really a lot of commanding projection. Now think about this for a second. All right, keep that in mind.
All right.
And then we're going to move to a 1924. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that a much darker color.
It's so much darker. I've never seen them side by side like that.
Yep.
That's amazing.
The much darker color, and a much darker sound.
It's like night and day. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. By 24, it was more about the nuance, the warmth of the bottom end. But you've still got the tie-in. So a lot of us today really like that dark sound.
That's beautiful.
The whole point of Lloyd Loar's attention to these details comes from his acoustic theories. See, the thing about music is that music was never invented, music was discovered. You know, it's a natural phenomenon.
Right.
And what Lloyd Loar focused on was the creation of overtones, or what he called partials. So there's a G note, right? That note is comprised of quite a few partials. And you can hear 12 of them with the human ear. And you can hear 12 of them on a mandolin. But they don't align with the frets. See, that's the thing. Everybody thinks your chimes, we call them chimes, are 12, 7, and 5, right?
Right.
Well, not exactly. They're almost 12. But for this purpose, I'm just going to use
Whoa! I've never seen that before.
yeah. So this is a Lloyd Loar experiment that you can do. The key to an F5 is that it has the capacity, the design, the element of carving the wood so that to emphasize all these partials. So you really need a really good mandolin to be able to hear this all the way up to 12. So you divide in half to get the first partial. You divide into thirds to get, see, that's third, to get the second partial, fifths, 6, 7. And then you can go 8, 9, 10, but the finger is too big to get your 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
That's
you have to get a
amazing.
little tiny, like the tip of a ruler or something, a very slim ruler, and put a little piece of felt on it to get the rest of them. So you can do all 12 on a Lloyd Loar.
I had no idea.
Yeah.
That is wild. So what is the advantage of having all 12 on a single string like that? Does it make it sound more full when you play?
To be able to have an instrument that can project all the partials is a powerful thing, because every note that you play has that complexity and nuance to it. See, that's what especially the 24 Loars are about, is complexity in its tone, rather than a simple note like, say, you might get on one of the earlier designs. But the F5 in general, every note is comprised of a lot of partials, and get this, they're all equal. Every note has an equal distribution.
That's awesome.
You've got power on every note, and you don't have that on some of the earlier designs of mandolins. That's why the tops have to be orchestrated together. The top and the back have to be tuned in a certain way so that they can project that without building one up stronger than the other.
Right,
if your top and back were, say, both tuned to an A note, every time you played an A note, the whole instrument would resonate. But then when you played a B flat, you got nothing.
Right.
So that's the key to the F5 design. And that's what that was one of the many things that Lloyd Loar brought to Gibson.
I really don't know much about this topic at all, but I know people often talk about these tone Versy contraptions that Lloyd Loar came up with, right?
The Versy.
The Versy.
You have to go like that when you say it.
The
Versy. The Versy brothers of near Palermo in Sicily immigrated to New York in the early 1900s, and they began building violins in New York. And they opened a shop, and they came up with an idea to create a secondary soundboard for a violin. Lloyd Loar became, I'm not sure whether he met them when he was in New York, when he came back from overseas, when he was entertaining troops. That would have been 1919, but Lloyd Loar was also back in New York for some time in 22 with the when the Gibson did the Guild convention there. So I feel like Lloyd Loar probably met the Versy brothers sometime around then and became intrigued with the idea of using their device, they call it the tone projector, in the mandolin. So this is what it looks like.
Whoa, I've never seen one in person before. That's amazing.
This is an authentic Versy tone producer. It's called. It's actually stamped.
Whoa.
Versy tone producer on the back. It's got these 2 feet that fit in right behind the bridge. It fits inside the mandolin like that to the underside of the top, and the 2 feet come up right behind the bridge. And the other foot comes back here. Now you can see there's a little tack, a little tiny tack that holds them in place.
Wow.
And that's all that holds it there. Gibson began putting these in, I'd say 90% of the mandolins.
Really?
Actually 90% of the F5s, the master models they made in 1924, and then quite a few of the other instruments as well.
Oh my goodness.
And then they also, for the sum of $15, they would take it out. And for another $15, they'd put it back in again. So the Versy became, almost from the start, became controversial. What did it do? Does it really help? Bluegrass people took them out. In the 70s, you know, Bill Monroe's mandolin didn't have one. So here's a Lloyd Loar, it's got a Versy in there. I'm going to pull it out. Now, the way Gibson did it was they would saw the backs off.
Saw them off?
With a little tiny jeweler saw. They just come around and they would cut through the little points here with a very thin saw, take the back off, take the Versy out. You know, you just really have to pull it out and set it aside, put the back on. If you've sawed really carefully right along the binding line, it fits right back in, and it looks pretty good. Wow. You shoot a little finish on there and send it back. It was a revolving door thing. The question is, what did it do? Well, there's a lot of thoughts about that. A lot of people think it reduces volume. Unfortunately, we don't have a Versy and non-Versy here to demonstrate. But the curious thing that I've found is that in an auditorium without any amplification, but a good auditorium, you know, those old style auditoriums where it really projects well. The Versy projects away from the mandolin, and a non-Versy F5 keeps the sound closer to the instrument.
I see, yeah.
So as it turns out, the non-Versy actually works better with a microphone, which is the way popular music developed after World War II. Also, when you try out a mandolin, you're right here and you're listening to it. You know, a lot of times I will listen to the back of my mandolin because to me the maple sounds different than the spruce.
Spruce, right?
And it's really cool. You know, the dark ones sound even darker back here. I mean, you know, I sit around and play like that all the time. Now, here's another thing. The early mandolins, like those 23s, the tone bars were a little close, just a little bit closer together. When the 24s came out, they had to move those tone bars to accommodate the Versy to sit in there.
Oh, interesting.
So now some of these retrofits, and the most famous is the Parrot mandolin. It's the first production, or what we think is the first actual production Loar other than the prototypes. Had a Versy in it, but the back had obviously been taken off, and the Versy was in backwards.
Oops.
Because, you know, they didn't have room for it.
Right, that makes sense.
Yeah. So, and it didn't work at all. It sounded awful.
Oh, I can imagine.
And then when Steve Gilchrist took it out, it sounded terrific, which added to that theory that the Versy is your enemy and you need to get it out. But if it's installed correctly and the instrument is tuned with that in mind, it's a tremendous sound that I'm very fond of.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
I never knew any of that stuff.
Yeah.
That's so cool. Thank you.
But you know, so it's just a little, it's kind of like a little spaceship.
It does look like,
Yeah.
it's like Star Trek. So Lloyd Loar only worked for the Gibson company for a few years, and there's a limited number of these F5 mandolins out there. How many known signed Loars are in existence? Do you know?
Well, there's a couple of guys, Darrell Wolfe and Tommy Eisenhower, that started writing this stuff down way back. Like myself, they went around to find every Lloyd Loar they could, but they also took photographs and started compiling a list. Wow. And their list has now been turned into a wonderful web archive by an Englishman named Dan Beamborn.
I know Dan, yeah.
And it's a tremendous resource. If memory serves, they have 270 signed Loar instruments identified. Okay. So now that's just what we know. That is what is extant. How many did they actually make? There are no records. But there are no production records from those days. Wow. There's no artifact to tell you how many were signed on each day except for the actual signature. But if you think about it, they usually come in clumps of consecutive numbers. So there were specific signing days that went from June 1st of 22 until December 1st of 24. And there were various numbers of signatures known to have been applied to labels for mandolins on those days. The biggest days were February 18th of 1924 and March 31st of 1924. There were 60 signed Lloyd Loar mandolins.
Whoa. So there could be a lot more out there, is that what you're saying?
Well, if you look at the blocks of numbers, there are some that are missing. How many, we don't know. So Stradivarius kept pretty accurate records of his production. He made nearly 1,000 violins. Only 600 of them are known to exist today. You assume that some were destroyed. I have witnessed to a few of master models that were destroyed. And there's all kinds of stories. Who know if they're true? I heard that there was a man in Pennsylvania that had his Lloyd Loar buried with him, but I don't know. Who knows? There probably are some that are unaccounted for.
Okay, wow.
And will they show up in a pawn shop? Will they show up in somebody's attic? Maybe. There have been those experiences in the last few years, but they're fewer and farther between because a lot of people have been searching for these things, and a lot of the guitar shows travel around the country and bring instruments out from the woodworks. So I think at this point we probably have the majority of them accounted for. But still, just thinking in terms of 300 instruments, that's quite a lot. When you consider that, say, the great luthier Randy Wood, for example, he spends probably at least 2 months building one of these mandolins.
That's a lot, yeah.
Now, did Lloyd Loar build mandolins? That's a question that we often get. And I think by now, most people realize that no, he did not build these instruments. He was an acoustic engineer that came into the Gibson company and was able to take advantage of a tremendous group of craftsmen, many from old world guilds. A lot of Dutch, a lot of German, Canadian. There were a lot of immigrants at Gibson who were doing woodworking and finish work, for example. Now, he came up with the designs, worked with these really talented people on all levels, and produced this tremendous mandolin. So that was his role. Now, one of the big things about the Lloyd Loar mandolin is the finish. Now, Loar did not invent the Gibson Cremona Brown. That actually was put on instruments before Lloyd Loar came to the factory, I think around 1919. Gibson ran an article in one of their sales journals that a man named Fred Miller had come up with this tremendous new finish that looked like $1 million. And they called it the Gibson Cremona Brown because it was exactly like a violin finish. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Fred Miller was the finish expert, but he was actually junior to a man named Cornelius Kivett. Did they come from a fine old European violin making school? No. They came to Gibson from the Romer automobile factory. They were painting fancy cars with varnish. They came to Gibson and they created this incredible finish. Now, when Loar came aboard, he went with a lighter color because he was going for that brighter sound. Isn't that something?
Interesting. Yeah.
The brighter mandolins, the lighter colored mandolins have the brighter sound, and the darker colored mandolins have the darker sound.
Like helps your mind categorize the sounds a little bit more. Yeah.
It's sort of like without the smell of food, the taste is not there.
That's so true. Yeah.
And I think it's the same thing.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm a nut.
Me too. So I know there has been some fluctuation in the market for Loars recently, but I guess over the past 40, 50 years, it seems like the value in the F5 Loars have just skyrocketed. What do you think the contributing factors to that uptick in the market would be?
Well, let's just go back, first of all, and say that this mandolin, and with the original case, in 1923 would have been $275. But by the 30s, there were ads in various papers for an F5, a used F5, which in the 30s would probably be one of these or something soon after, for $150. When Bill Monroe, on that fateful day, on January 10th of 1946, walked into that barbershop and found his F5 that became the whole reason for why we're sitting here right now, he paid $150.
Wow.
At least that's what he told me. And I actually, if you'll check back into my blog and read that episode, I actually have a copy of a newspaper advertisement for that mandolin for $150.
Oh,
and I've identified the very barbershop and the hotel where it was in. So $150 is about where it stayed until the 60s, the mid-60s. Stayed pretty much flat and even. There was only one reason, and one reason alone, that the 1923 F5 began to be worth more than a brand new Gibson. and that was Bill Monroe. By the 60s and early 70s, a new Gibson F5 just sounded awful. There was too much wood in them. The finish was really thick lacquer. I mean, that finish works great for a Les Paul guitar, you know, and a thick piece of wood works great for an electric guitar, but it doesn't work for an acoustic mandolin. And so when I came into this thing, I wanted to sound great. I wanted my music to sound really like I wanted to sound. A lot of projection, a lot of power, a lot of warmth, and you just couldn't get that on a new mandolin. So you had to find an old mandolin. So we started looking and looking and looking. And when there's a limited quantity of something and a lot of people looking for it, then the price is going to go up. So the first chance I had to buy a Loar, I told you in the story, was $1,000. I think prior to that, I had some friends who had bought them for around $600 to $650, somewhere in there. This is in the 60s, though. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of money when gas is 27 cents a gallon.
Fair.
You know? So I finally got my first Loar in 1977 when I was with the Bluegrass Alliance. And at the time, I was making $50 a show when we worked. And it was a tremendous stretch to come up with the $6,500 that I paid for it then.
Wow.
And that was about the market value. Well, by 1970, we were looking at, you know, 7,500, and then all through the 70s, 8,500. I think it was 1980 that the first one sold for 10,000.
Wow.
And then in the early 80s, the trickle-down economy, the gas lines, you don't remember all that, but I did. You know, you're out trying to make a living playing music, and you can only buy gas on Monday, Wednesdays, or Fridays, and you got to get from Tallahassee to Buffalo.
Wow.
And what are you going to do?
Oh my goodness. That's awful.
So the prices started going back down, and so once again, you could get the $7,500. See, there's precedence for a fluctuation.
Sure.
By the mid-70s, there was this whole bluegrass revival. You know, there was Bonnie and Clyde movie, the 69, the Sam Peckinpah movie that Flatt and Scruggs, he used the original 1948 recording of Foggy Mountain Breakdown. Oh man, it's so good, so good. The music in that movie is so good. And then along comes Andy Griffith, and he's got the Dillards playing, and then there's the Beverly Hillbillies. Flatt and Scruggs were regulars, and they did that theme song, and then of course Deliverance. So all of a sudden there was a real bluegrass revival, and there were bluegrass bands everywhere. You know, I was in college, I was making more money playing gigs on the weekends than, you know, a lot of my friends who had graduated from the English department make today. but then it just started going way up. By 1990, I sold the first one for 20,000. Okay, by 1996, in a hotel room in Louisville, Kentucky, I hit 50,000. And 2000, 100,000.
What?
And in 2006, 250. $250,000.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
that is
$250,000.
Wow.
And then 2007, 2008, there was the whole Bernie Madoff thing and the recession that came in, and the mandolins just plummeted. I mean, there were quite a few on the market because a lot of people who had bought these instruments in the 60s and 70s wanted to sell them. And a lot of them had heard they were worth $200,000. And so all of a sudden the market was glutted.
Sure.
There were Loars everywhere for $200,000, and nobody's going to pony up that kind of money with the economy the way it was.
Oh, sure.
That's kind of adjusted now. Things are adjusted, and I think that a good way to think about it is utility versus imagination. Okay, utility is how much the actual instrument is worth to you as a tool. I'm a musician.
Sure.
I record. I want the very best. It's worth a lot to me to have that. The imagination. I want to be like Bill Monroe. I want to play the mandolin he has. I want to have the prettiest one so I can show my friends. Sure. And I have a really good job and I make a lot of money. So, yeah, somewhere between is where the price is always going to be.
Right.
What is a Lloyd Loar worth today? It's worth exactly what someone is willing to pay for it and what someone is willing to sell it for. So.
It's a good way to put it, yeah.
Yep.
These mandolins are not only collector's items, but they're also played by some of the best mandolin players in the world and held up as the gold standard today for luthiers and players alike. Why do you think these have held up so well compared to other mandolins out there?
Well, it's a great design. Unless abused, the Loars rarely need anything. They rarely need a neck set. They rarely have caved-in tops, unless they've been abused. I rescued a Loar just last year from a shed in Colorado.
Oh, man.
That was completely gone apart.
Oh, so sad.
And thank goodness for Steve Gilchrist. He took a look at it and said, no problem. And it's singing like you wouldn't believe today.
Oh, wow, that's amazing.
So if they're abused, they're going to need a repair. But if you're going to get one repaired, go to one of maybe 3 or 4 people in the world that is capable of really doing the right job.
Sure.
And the finish is the biggest part of all. The finish is a complicated process that includes a shellac sealer. It includes a series of color stains. We don't know exactly what the varnish is, but it's not a violin varnish. It's a synthetic polymerized varnish that Cornelius Kivett and Fred Miller came up with in 1922 that sort of defies analysis even on a pantograph machine. And then there's a top coat of French polish. In other words, there's an oil varnish protecting the color, but there's also an alcohol varnish top coat. So oil and alcohol don't mix. How does that work? Well, it works because, I think maybe there might be a place here. Yeah, if the alcohol wears off, which it will do from wear, the oil varnish is still underneath to protect it.
Wow.
So you can just dab a little bit of the alcohol on there because it just flakes off.
That's brilliant.
So it really is it's a design for longevity. It's actually designed to be able to fix itself if you'll let it. But unfortunately, Gibson lost the ability to do this finish. And so what happened is they just would spray lacquer on it. And I don't know why, but so often they just removed the whole finish and started again.
Sad.
So there's so many of those mandolins that have had that done to them. But if left alone, they're going to be fine from now on. So it's the test of time. And it's the fact that Bill Monroe, Bobby Osborne, all the way up to Mike Marshall, John Reichman, Chris Thiele, Andrew Marlin. I mean, a good player who wants the best sound is going to wind up with one of these. And I've had that argued with me. You know, I've played a Loar, and it doesn't sound as good as my so-and-so. That's because you're trying to make the mandolin do what you do rather than let the mandolin teach you to do what it wants to do. You know, it's like driving a Ferrari or riding a great racehorse. You know, you can't just get on there and drive it like your VW or whip it like a draft horse. You got to be able to work with it. So that involves knowing where to put your pick. And also to be able to use the various aspects of it.
Bravo, bravo.
All right, here, I'll let you.
Oh my word!
Check it
Wow.
out. Yep.
Thank you. Oh, that's beautiful. Oh wow. So this is one of the ferns, is that right? Or?
Yeah, that's a very early fern, and it's still got the Cremona brown finish on the back, but the front is they've gone with the typical fern color, and then the top
Interesting.
coat is all the early nitrocellulose.
So yeah, what would be the difference from one of these to the Lloyd Loar mandolins?
The finish, primarily the finish.
Interesting.
Yeah, it has a lot of characteristics of the Lloyd Loar, including the sound.
So after Lloyd Loar left, though, you were saying that the quality of Gibsons kind of went downhill, sadly, right?
It was a gradual thing. The first thing to go was the finish, the varnish. So a Loar varnish was a process that took months. Nitrocellulose lacquer is a process that takes days. So it just made economic sense to just move to nitrocellulose across the board. But it's a great mandolin. This particular one, the lacquer top coat changes the tone color. See, that's part of that nuance I'm talking about.
Sure.
Yeah, so it becomes a little. It's a little
Yeah, a
brighter,
little brighter, yeah.
a little less of that nuance, that
Kinda
full complexity.
Tighter, yeah.
Yeah. But good mandolin. I mean, they're great mandolins. This is very similar to what Bobby Osborne played, and quite a few other people played these as well. The various national things or international things that were going on in the country really affected a lot of industry in the late teens and early 20s. Even though the pandemic had lessened and the war was over, but there was a deflationary recession when all the soldiers came home wanting their jobs back. And that was a hard thing to come out of, and people just weren't buying mandolins.
Sure.
In 1917, Gibson assigned over 10,000 serial numbers. And by 1924, I think they only did around 2,000.
Whoa.
So Lloyd Loar came to Gibson, and he was brought to Gibson by his good friend Lewis Williams. And Lewis Williams was very well-loved, affable guy. You know, everybody loved him. He also was a musician, and he and Lloyd Loar were friends, and I think they worked together really well. The board of directors, headed by Judge John Adams, fired Lewis Williams. This was in September of 23, if memory serves, and hired a man who had no musical background whatsoever, but was into manufacturing, Henry Ferris. And Ferris came into Gibson and immediately complained that they were underfunded, and started firing personnel, reducing the number of models made, and doing all sorts of cost-saving things. And for some reason that I can't quite resolve within the mindset that he brought to the company, there also was a mandate to push all the Lloyd Loar, all the master models on through production,
Interesting.
to go ahead and get them out.
Huh.
So that's why in February and March of 24, there were over 100 master model instruments made. And then for the rest of the year, they basically trickled out all the rest of them to get the Loar signature before he left.
Right.
But it flooded the market with a product that wasn't selling anyway. So a lot of those instruments hung on shelves in music stores across the land for quite a number of years before they found homes. Boy, wouldn't you like to have a spaceship, time travel? But anyway, Ferris claimed he had made a profit with Gibson, but it was not nearly enough. And a year later, when he came into the board of directors, he exploded against the people on the board, Judge Adams and the whole board, who were the stockholders. And he suggested to cease all dividends, and Judge Adams handed him a piece of paper and asked him to write out his resignation.
There you go.
And the accountant that Ferris had hired to compile the numbers to prove his point, Guy Hart, was immediately appointed general manager. And one of the first things Guy Hart did was arrange with Lloyd Loar for Lloyd Loar's exit strategy. Now, I think Loar had already become disenchanted with the whole thing because he had so many duties there. I mean, he was not only acoustical engineer, but he was also production manager. He was in charge of advertising. He was in charge of training sales representatives and interacting with he was in charge of the repair department.
I didn't know that.
All this in addition to designing these instruments.
Wow.
And at the same time, what he really wanted to do is his acoustic experiments. But Loar immediately took a job in Boston for a publishing company.
Right.
And he left Kalamazoo after Christmas. He had Christmas dinner with his wife in Brookfield, Missouri, and left Kalamazoo and started in Boston as editor and writer for Jacobs Publications. And there's where he stayed until 1930. He came back to Kalamazoo in 33 and started Vibitone and started building electric instruments in
Right.
33.
That's so interesting, yeah.
So when Loar left Gibson, Guy Hart steered them toward a path whereby they were going to produce something that would sell. And at first it was banjos, but then, the guitar. You know, the jazz guitar is the thing, especially when microphones got better. A jazz musician, you know, who wants to improvise, who wants to play chords, the guitar was just a better choice. So that became the future of Gibson. Guy Hart was general manager from 24 to, I think, till after World War II.
Kind of in that key, wasn't it?
Take that, helicopter. Let's play a tune before we go.
Oh, I'd love to.
I'll let you hold this.
Oh no! Please don't give this to me. Oh dear. Oh, that's beautiful.
How about a little bit of that old standard Red Wing?
Yeah, absolutely.
It just goes without saying, huge thanks to Tony for sharing this amazing wisdom and experience with us here. And please do check out his other resources down at the links below. And if you've made it this far and you actually like content like this, please consider subscribing and joining over on Patreon to help support the channel and see more videos like this actually come to life. Of course, if you do want to see more content and you want to see more Loar specific content, then please check out my documentary on these amazing mandolins right here. I'll see you over there real soon.